Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in People. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt. This Week in People is brought to you by PIN. Redefining HR Media Group is something I'm going to share a little bit more details on next week, but proud to have PIN as a supporter of the Redefining HR community. Quick reminder for first-time viewers, all the links to the articles that I go over will be included in the show notes so that you can check them out and go deeper. Let's dig in. So the first article actually wasn't new from this week. It was from last week, but just hit my radar late in the week. But it was a joint report by the World Economic Forum and Mercer, a really meaty white paper on designing the future of work post-pandemic. And so there's some really interesting statistics, some really interesting data in this report that is definitely worth your time. It's a long read, so grab a coffee, dig in when you could actually carve out some time to really digest it, but it is worth your time. A quick one here. I happened to catch Toucan, which is a tech company, build out their career site on Notion. And I think that particularly for smaller companies that struggle with getting the resources and time from their dev teams to build out interesting career sites, I think we're going to see more companies using platforms like Notion and Coda to build interactive, dynamic career sites. So definitely something to be thinking about, particularly for those of you viewers in smaller organizations with limited budgets and resources. This was a really interesting article this week from MIT Sloan on how leaders can basically make Black Lives Matter in the workplace. They break it down in a couple different areas, but specifically they talk a bit about HR. And I wanted to flag this because they really reinforce the need for HR to ensure that representation is happening at all levels of the organization, from the executive team all the way down. And so there's more practical tips, but I think that's a point that definitely deserves reinforcing for all of us in the HR and people space, particularly as we're working to make our organizations more representative and more inclusive. Again, continuing on the diversity and inclusion news updates, this was an interesting article from Forbes this week about Microsoft for the first time announcing their disability representation in their annual diversity report. And so I think as often as companies started publishing these reports, years ago, rarely do we see any data about disability representation within the organization. So this was one of the first steps that I'm aware of a company including that, and it will be interesting to see if other companies pick up on this trend and begin including their data as well. I think it's a great step to kind of know where companies are and also have visibility into how we can begin to make our companies truly more inclusive, including both all factors of inclusion, but also disability, where, very often that is not at the forefront of that conversation. There was an interesting and somewhat depressing article from NPR this week about the pandemic's impact on women in the workforce. In September alone, over 840,000 women, 865,000 women dropped out of the workforce. And that is a number that is 4 times larger than men. And this is going to be a massive issue for society, for work, for employers. And I think it's something that people leaders need to be thinking about, particularly as we move to the other side of the pandemic and really work to attract and bring more women back into the workforce. This is driven by many things that are happening right now and all things COVID. A large factor of it cited in the article were school closings and women taking the brunt of leading that childcare at home. So definitely something for this to be on our radar. There's been many articles on this topic, but it's important for us to be thinking about. The latest entrant into the work from home and remote work group is Reddit. So they announced this week they're going to be shifting to remote. And in their announcement, they actually had some specific factors around considerations. That included compensation, actually getting into having one set compensation range based on San Francisco and New York salaries for employees in the United States. That levels them with their other country policies around one comp range per country. They also get into the role of what an office will be like once it's safe to go back into an office. And it's really more of a coffee house, meeting shop, type environment. And so people won't be permanently based there. They have real estate. They're going to use it in different ways. And this is pretty consistent with what I've seen when other companies have announced their plans for real estate. So this week is a prelude to what is going to be a very interesting week next week. For those viewers in the U.S., for those viewers abroad who have operations in the U.S., you well know that next week on Tuesday is Election Day here in the U.S. And this day is going to put a lot of stress and pressure on people operators, on employees, on citizens, on everyone. And the reality is that is not going to be an event that is a one-day event. You know, the election itself, election day is one day. We've already had 60 million votes in the U.S., so clearly that we're well underway with this, and we're going to have counting ballots that's going to extend well beyond actual election day. So I think that this is going to be a pretty rocky couple weeks, couple of months, particularly for those of us in North America as we deal with the election and the aftermath of the election, regardless who is elected. So there's been some resources that have been shared around how people operators can support their businesses in these times. This is one of the better ones I've seen from LifeLabs Learning, curated feedback from over 600 people operators on what they're going to be doing. And so there's lots of data, templates, and ideas for people operators. Definitely worth a bookmark. And if things aren't scary enough in North America, we also have Halloween coming up on Saturday. So I think it's fitting to close out this episode with a plead from one of my favorite princesses. Help us, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're our only hope. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.